All right, I know some people are still shuffling in, but hopefully everybody's got their bellies full and they're ready to take in another good talk. Since most of you were here yesterday, I'm not going to go through Dr. Kathryn Bayne's extensive and impressive biography other than to say that she is the Global Director for the Association of Assessment and Accreditation of Laboratory Animal Care International, known to most of us as AAALAC International. I also want to say that while she is the bigwig at AAALAC, we actually have asked her to take that hat off for this afternoon and serve as a bit of a historian for us. So we've been hearing for 2 days about kind of where we're at with social housing, and she's now going to remind us all of where we've been. So with that, Dr. Bayne.
It is indeed a pleasure to be here, so thank you again for inviting me. Do we have the clicker, Eric? Oh, here it is. I found it. Sorry. So I was asked to give a historical perspective on social housing. This was my first reaction. You know you're getting old when, and here are some of my favorite quotes to that effect. You know you're getting old when the twinkle in your eye is merely a reflection from the sun on your bifocals. You know you're getting old when you say something to your kids that your mother said to you and you always hated it. And my personal favorite, you know you're getting old when your idea of a night out is sitting on the patio. So for today's purposes, you know you're getting old when they ask you to give a talk from a historical perspective. So gee, thanks, Eric. I feel ever so much better about myself now. All right, well, I think there is some rationale, if you will, to why he asked me to give this talk. And part of that is that I think I was there near the beginning, perhaps not at the beginning, but near the beginning of when we started to be concerned about the psychological well-being of non-human primates. So let's just step back a little bit and talk about what the primary emphasis of a historical perspective is. And I believe it's uncovering how things change over time with the objective of better understanding the present and the future, not the past. So a historical perspective, according to Nisbet in his book, The History of the Idea of Progress, is that it reveals progress that is inexorable change over time from lower to higher states of knowledge. And I think over the last 2 days, we have very definitively seen how the body of knowledge is increasing in the field of most broadly environmental enrichment and our laboratory animal behavior, and of course, more specifically, social housing. So I want to talk a little bit over the next several minutes about how there's been a paradigm shift in how we view social housing. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what factors contributed to our expanding approach to social housing of laboratory animals and what related issues have resulted from those discussions and that research. And can we use our retrospectoscope to judge the future of social housing? So for me, perhaps my own bias has been injected into this presentation. It begins with the non-human primate, clearly a species of tremendous concern to us as researchers, as veterinarians, as those who support the research in every aspect, as well as the general public. In the old days, you got to have a historical perspective and say old days, right? And you got to have some black and white pictures, which are coming later. Rhesus monkeys were imported from India and placed into groups in holding rooms for quarantine. Shortly before I came to the NIH, that was still the practice. Now, those animals were not necessarily familiar with each other. They had just undergone the tremendous stress of shipping, and they were currently experiencing the novelty of a new environment. No surprise then that there was fighting and reports of disease. And there was one published report of 95% of the animals in quarantine having intestinal parasites. So not exactly the cleanest way to house animals that were coming in for biomedical research. And it was recognized that this was certainly a problem. So the procedures were changed to put all imported primates into individual housing. Still the animals coming from India, but put into individual housing. And as clearly, because they were individually housed, there was no fighting. That eliminated that 100%. But it also resulted in significantly reduced disease incidence. So the health of the animals was better. The impact on the behavior of those animals was just simply not recognized. It was not a time when that was on the radar screen, and it just simply was not recognized. Well, many in the room may know that in 1978, the Indian government banned exportation of non-human primates. Contemporaneous with that was the creation of the National Primate Plan, of which NIH was a key leader in that effort. There had been some preliminary steps taken to establish domestic breeding colonies. But those domestic breeding colonies were being reconsidered, reevaluated, and after the ban was actually imposed, thoroughly escalated. And that was all part of the National Primate Plan. So you still then would have some social history, rearing history of the animals. They were either in mother-infant cages or in groups. But the quarantine procedures didn't change. They still entailed single housing. Just 7 years later, so one of the things about when you review history, I think telescope back down how events have occurred in sequence. And 7 years is not that long a period of time. So banned in 1978, and just 7 years later, the Animal Welfare Act was amended. It was the Food Security Act of 1985, approved by Congress. And this included provisions to amend the Animal Welfare Act as the Improved Standards for Laboratory Animals Act, which was enacted by the end of the year. And as you've heard throughout the conference, among other things, it directed the Secretary of Agriculture to establish regulations to provide a physical environment adequate to promote the psychological well-being of non-human primates. A very innovative phrase for its time. I'm not sure anybody quite knew how to define it. Perhaps we're still wrestling with the definition of the term, but very advanced thinking for its time. The USDA commented that, as related to the passage of this act, that social interaction is an integral part of the psychological well-being of non-human primates, and we believe it is appropriate to address such social groupings in the context of an overall approach to promoting the psychological well-being of non-human primates. So ding, 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 ring the bell. So from 1978, where we were starting to just pull animals out of their groups, put them in single houses for quarantine and keep them that way, 7 years later comes the initial language into regulation and our law that social housing is important. Again, concurrent with that, the 1985 edition comes out from the National Research Council. So the USDA and Congress is saying social housing is very, very important. And these are excerpts from the 1985 guide, the next couple slides. The 85 guide said the social environment includes all interactions among individuals of a group or among those able to communicate. And I confess that phrase confounds me. And looking at it again, backwards in time, I guess they really believed that there were some animals out there that didn't communicate. So if there's no communication, then there's no social activity among those animals. The guide goes on to say the effects of social environment on caged animals vary with the species and experience of the animals. They're often more difficult to define than the effects of physical environment. And I think we're certainly still feeling that today for some species of lab animals. And these two phrases I excerpted deliberately because I think they really set the tone for social housing in the 85 guide. So again, remember, the USDA is saying it's essential. The guide is saying there's little objective evidence for defining adequate care in relation to social environment. The data are limited and contradictory and lack sufficient guidance to establish absolute recommendations. Talk about a contrast. Was it any wonder that our community was left in a quandary? Now, the U.S. government principles, which have been referred to throughout the conference as well, the 9 principles developed by the Interagency Research Advisory Committee, which was a body of federal agencies that came together over animal-related matters. And they published their 9 principles in 1985, and Principle 7 says the living conditions of animals should be appropriate for their species and contribute to their health and comfort, not just sustain or support, but contribute to it. And that's as close as they get to speaking about social housing. Now, I put on these 3 posters, and you've probably seen some of them around this building even over the course of the last 2 days. These are the NIH series of posters, and they also appeared shortly around the time that I started at NIH back in 1987. So the one on the left says good animal care and good science go hand in hand, and the thinking there was it's not just the physical health, but the overall health of the animal. And then we had great support from on high, Lewis Sullivan saying the balance between promoting human health and protecting the welfare of animals in research can and must be maintained. So here we have the first insertion of the word welfare into an NIH poster series, and these things are distributed all around campus. And then finally, on the far right is the one that was published relevant to the environmental enrichment program that we developed, again, to educate the internal NIH community about the value of providing. And the first thing on the list, social housing. So here are those black and white photos. So shortly after I started, the director of NIH at that time was Dr. Weingarten. And he instructed the deputy director for the intramural research program, Dr. Ed Rall, to develop an NIH non-human primate management plan. And the point of the plan was to address the issue of promoting the psychological well-being of primates used in research. So his response was, we have this amendment to the Animal Welfare Act. The USDA has not yet published its regulations. NIH wants to get out front and see how we can address the point and not wait for others to come along. This is a science-based organization. Let's develop a plan accordingly. So that was the philosophy, and that resulted in the publication of this document, the NIH Non-Human Primate Intramural Management Plan, so just for the NIH campus. Now, part of the recommendations that came out of the plan were based on 2 surveys, actually. The first one, shortly after the directive from Dr. Weingarten and Dr. Rall down to me, was to evaluate, to do a survey of the NIH primate-using community. And so at that time, we could survey 56 investigators and 5 veterinarians from 10 institute centers and divisions, that's ICDs. At that time, approximately 85% of the investigators surveyed housed their primates individually. And this resulted in about 70% of the primates at the NIH being individually housed. Approximately 52% of investigators were or would be willing, as they indicated in survey responses, to socially house their primates. So that was our baseline. How do you develop a plan if you don't know what you've got in your colony? Well, I'm sorry to say that after 3 years of concerted effort, we made very minimal progress in social housing. However, we made, I think, quite significant progress in non-social enrichment techniques. 61% of the investigators surveyed in 1990 housed their primates singly, with approximately 78% of the primates managed by those investigators to be housed singly. At that time, 3 years after the initial survey, 46%, so a lower number, of the investigators not social housing their primates indicated a willingness to do so. There was great consternation among the scientific community at the NIH, but the plan marched forward and made the recommendation that social housing should be considered an appropriate means of providing enrichment in the cases where those animal care and use committees approve an animal study proposal that didn't preclude it. So again, if the protocol stipulated individual housing for a scientific reason, that was that. I think part of part of the concern were reports similar to this one, and this one's easy to highlight just because it got into the peer-reviewed public literature, or not peer-reviewed, but public literature. And this is the risks associated with social housing that was of great concern to the research community back in the late 80s and early 90s. So here, Scott Line and colleagues, including famous Hal Markowitz, they wanted to form a group of primates, and 10 of the 13 monkeys that they put together sustained injuries during fights in the first 8 days following group formation, and one female actually died of general trauma. So when you have reports of that, it's very hard to, in the absence of data that now is more prevalent about the merits of social housing, both physiologically, immunologically, neurologically, it was a hard sell to socially house our primates. But fast forward the clock just a few years to 1998, and what we have is an entire report coming out of the National Research Council on psychological well-being of non-human primates and how to address it. And two key statements out of this report are so significantly different from the 1985 guide that I wanted to highlight them for you. So this report said social interactions are considered to be one of the most important factors influencing the psychological well-being of non-human primates. And as a corollary to that, knowing that most primates benefit from social interactions, it should be obvious that they can be harmed by a lack of social interaction. Powerful statements. So let's just take a minute to look at the changing philosophy regarding social housing. And I'm going to use the guide to illustrate this point because it is perhaps one of the most used documents, and what it says tends to be incorporated in our programs around the country and throughout the world. So you may have seen a slide much like this presented by others, the various iterations of the guide, showing not only in the early days its rather abbreviated format, now in 2011 up to 154 pages, and I should note that 1985, 96, and 2011, the page count does not include appendices, which also thickened over time. But you can see the volume increased, and so more content in each iteration of the guide, just physically. But when you dissect it down to social housing, the 1985 guide had just 25 lines of text dedicated to the subject versus 34 lines of text in the 1996 guide. Now that's not a big difference in number of lines, but of course that's a very glossy way of looking at something. And when you look at the actual words used, then you start seeing more significant differences. And in addition, the newer guide also addressed social housing in other sections than just a social housing section. So under space, for example, reference was made to socially housing animals. The 1985 guide talked about caging systems in this manner, that they should facilitate research while maintaining good health of the animals. So again, a rather stark absence of any reference to behavior, to welfare, just the health. The physical health is what we were really worried about at that point. In 1996, we started to understand more by then that space is a very complex topic, and things such as animal performance indices of health, reproduction, growth, behavior, activity, and the use of the space itself can be used to assess the adequacy of the housing. So more than just, is the animal healthy? So the 1996 guide was seminal in many ways because it established a broader horizon for social housing, for environmental enrichment. And indeed, the term behavioral management, which you heard referred to yesterday, really came into its own in 1996 in a venue that was, again, commonly used throughout our industry. The behavioral management program was designed as essentially being tripartite, comprised of a structural environment, a social environment, and the activity of the animal. The 1996 guide, in referencing social housing under the behavioral management section, says it's desirable that social animals be housed in groups. When it's appropriate and compatible with the protocol, social animals should be housed in physical contact with conspecifics. So we have that first should. It's not a must. It's not mandatory by AAALAC vernacular, but it is a strong encouragement when you look at how should is defined in the 1996 guide. They go on to say in 1996 that programs should allow conspecific social interaction and the development of hierarchies within or between enclosures, much as what we saw with Steve Shapiro's chimpanzees' interactions between enclosures. Appropriate social interactions among members of the same species, and here conspecifics, again, is introduced into our mainstream document, are essential to normal development and well-being. Social environment might buffer the effects of a stressful situation, reduce behavioral abnormality, increase opportunities for exercise, and expand species-typical behavior and cognitive stimulation. And many of these points have been very nicely illustrated by the speakers today as well as yesterday. The guide was not all rose-colored glasses, however, because there is some discussion of the potential risks associated with social housing, the need for training of staff, recognition of behavior of the species you're working with, and that it can be risky for some species of animals. Now, moving to the 2011 guide, interestingly, and for purposes of today, really wanted to draw out and call to your attention, the section that was behavioral management was renamed behavioral and social management. So I think that placed additional emphasis on what we're seeing as a very emerging theme through the evolution of the guide, and in particular this 2011 document where social housing has become so highly profiled. And the document in 2011 says single housing of social species should be the exception and justified based on experimental requirements or veterinary-related concerns about animal well-being. The need for single housing should be reviewed on a regular basis by the IACUC and veterinarian. Again, though, like the 1996 guide, the discussion of social housing is not limited to just the social housing section. It appears in discussion elsewhere through the document, including that's referencing space, in particular under non-human primates. Further emphasis is placed on social housing and states that the table of space recommendations is based on the needs of pair or group housed animals, so no longer based on just individually housed animals. So again, predicating that this is going to be the baseline method of housing. And like all social animals, non-human primates should normally have social housing. Now, I'm obviously very small print, not expecting you to read it, but hopefully the big print you can see. I wanted to give a plug to our colleagues at OLAW for developing a really helpful FAQ on social housing. And as was referenced, I believe yesterday, it was mentioned, maybe in one of the breakout groups, they had a very informative webinar with Bob Willems from the USDA and Axel Wolf from OLAW talking about non-human primate enrichment and social housing. And I've covered some of this before, but I wanted to go into a little in-depth on one part that I didn't touch on yesterday, regarding AAALAC's implementation of the 2011 guide and expectations for social housing. We do recognize that in some cases, institutions are going to need to purchase or modify existing caging to address the social needs of their animals. And so what the council determined was for big significant changes like that, kind of a capital improvement change, they were going to give a 3-year phase-in period. Now that clock started September 1st, 2011, and so the clock ends September 1st, 2014. Under that phase-in period, the lack of appropriate caging for social housing any species of animal, not just primates, any species of animal, is going to be considered what we are calling a temporary suggestion for improvement. So that does not change your accreditation status. However, after September 1st, 2014, it becomes a mandatory item for correction. So the expectation is we've given institutions a 3-year heads up. You've got to be social housing those animals that you can, and that may entail some cage modification or cage purchase, and we've given 3 years for that to occur. So we also recognized that at the end of 3 years, some of our international clients who may have 10,000 primates or more, and that cage replacement may even be challenging to accomplish in 3 years, might need even additional time. What Council has determined is that they better have a plan and a procurement schedule in place, and that Council will then be demanding accomplishment of various milestones for meeting that plan. So Council is very serious about this, and they intend to follow it quite closely with all of our accredited institutions around the world. We did publish a position statement. I commented yesterday on how position statements are derived. For those of you that were not in the audience yesterday, let me just briefly summarize or recap that AAALAC tends to rely on others to establish standards, whether that be the governments of different countries, the national academies, scientific literature, but every once in a while, AAALAC publishes what it considers to be an important standard that we refer to as position statements. When Council develops a position statement, it is made available for a 30-day public comment period, and then it is forwarded to the executive committee of our Board of Trustees for review and approval. So it is not something we undertake lightly, and indeed Council views them very seriously when they go out and conduct site visits. And in this case, our position statement emphasizes that AAALAC considers social housing to be the default method of housing unless there's one of the 3 primary reasons: the health of the animal, its behavior, or scientific necessity, which has been reviewed and approved by the IACUC or comparable oversight body if it's another country. And it goes on to talk about if the animal has to be singly housed, how to best deal with that. I also mentioned yesterday that the Council developed a frequently asked question on social housing and social experience, and there's the URL. Again, I don't want to spend an inordinate amount of time on it because I did so yesterday, but I didn't feel this talk would be complete because I do believe these steps taken by OLAW and AAALAC reflect part of the whole evolutionary process that we've been undergoing in our views towards social housing, and that those views are becoming more crystallized, that social housing is an absolute unless there are one of those 3 reasons to have to single house the animals, no matter what species. So our frequently asked question refers back to our position statement, but also talks about this concept of social experience that I went into some detail yesterday. And just to re-show that chart, where part-time social housing provides one level of depth of social experience that's enriched greatly by full-time social housing, but even full-time social housing can be further enriched by other social experience, whether that's dogs that are released with their pen mate out into a play yard with other dogs, whether it's cats that are taken out of their pair house situation and put in a playroom with other cats, whether it's, you name it, monkeys that are put into an exercise room. There are opportunities for yet even broader social experience. And so AAALAC does view full-time social housing as the preferred method, but recognizes that there will be situations where perhaps part-time social housing may have to be what is afforded the animal, but to not ignore the social experience that can be offered that's broader than the contact with a conspecific, physical contact with a conspecific. And we heard several discussions today across species about whether the human can be considered a conspecific, but certainly I think AAALAC would consider that part of the social experience that the animal has. AAALAC has also recorded a podcast, which was just uploaded to our website earlier this week, and so I would encourage you to go listen to that. We're intending to have a series of podcasts on topics that are of particular interest to our accredited institutions. Social housing was the first one, and it was a natural selection to have this topic done first, because it is one that we're receiving many, many questions on. And it's just about a 15-minute presentation, and usually with, it'll be Dr. John Bradfield, my colleague at the AAALAC office, interviewing someone knowledgeable in the field. In this case, Dr. Jeffrey Wyatt from University of Rochester, who some of you may know has been doing a lot of work with social housing of rabbits. So I'd encourage you to go to our website under Education and Outreach and click on the link. So I wanted to turn to some other species just briefly. I do consult with an institution that has a lot of dogs, and I am aware that institutions have reasons for single housing dogs. And so, you know, this is our standard. Yes, this is what we would see, certainly in the old days, but even today we still see some institutions that single house their dogs for specific research reasons. I think the next step in the evolution was this concept of having a kennel, a run, if you will, made available to the dogs, and Dr. Mounier was very good about showing their more progressive version of that at GSK. Again, I think that clearly this is an older picture, and I use it for a deliberate reason, because, I mean, yes, they have more space, and yes, they're probably socially housed, but how does that look to you? Still pretty institutionalized. So one of my clients has done this with a little encouragement. So what we have here is are pairs of dogs, and they have tremendous sight lines down the wing of the building, recognizing that the color vision of dogs is not that of humans. They still decided to include some color, thinking that if it made the overall environment more cheerful for the people, that might also translate back to the animals. There are sound baffles in the room. There are windows in the room on both sides of the kennel, and these are indoor-outdoor runs, and so the outside part, although again this is now a slightly older picture than this one, it's still the same building, goes to an outdoor run, and then there's a fence here, and then every day the dogs are let out in small compatible groups, regardless of the weather, I might say. I think they have some minimum criteria where the weather gets really, if it's really actively snowing or below a certain temperature, they don't go outside. But even on a mild snowy day, the dogs will go outside and romp around in their play yard. They are afforded beds and ramps to get up onto shelves, and this allows then a lot more visibility. And as was described earlier by Dr. Mounier, when the dogs can see what's coming, there seems to be less barking. And in this picture, you can see there are a number of us in the room, and the dogs look really quite calm. So I consider this one of the better indoor-outdoor run housing situations that I've come across in my career. So kudos to this institution. Now, when I was at NIH, this is what we thought we were doing really, really good for cats. And so this was a cat area, and the technicians figured out how much the cats really liked being able to look out the windows of the doors, see what was going on in the corridor. I'm hoping at a minimum this is still in place if these animals are still housed here. we added shelves and things for them to play with. They were socially housed. This was not the entire cat colony, but a group that could, by protocol, be housed socially. And we thought at the time that we were doing really well. And then a client of mine, with some encouragement, did this. So I'm hoping you're sensing an evolution in how we're housing a variety of species. And you've seen wonderful pictures from several other speakers today as well as yesterday. But these are animals on active research protocols. Some of them are on metabolic studies, and with a little encouragement, the institution completely abandoned the use of metabolic cages, and they've actually published on a system, what they call a cageless system for collecting urine and feces. And so the cats are trained, they're group housed, and they are trained to go into the cageless urine and feces collection system and do their business and then exit. And no one has to spend a minute in a metabolic cage. So they can remain socially housed, and the investigators are getting the data they need in a flawless manner. So I think it's something that we really, again, if you bring the scientists together who have the specific needs, and they may even have the technological know-how, or they have some. We were thinking about the dairy cattle that would go into wear the collar and would go into a barn and get a certain amount of feed, and we were thinking that system somehow with these cats. And the scientists said, oh, well, let me think about this a little bit more. And they, with the veterinarians and those of us who were consulting with them, came up with a cageless system. So what you see here, though, is not the cageless system. But instead, what we have are animal housing rooms where cats are socially housed, and there are windows between rooms so the cats can view into the room next door. Now, those of you that know cat behavior fully understand that they're not pack animals. They're not social like a dog would be. They do form social relationships, but they are quite different from many other species. But regardless, what we've been able to achieve is we've got ramps, and this room has been modified even further, and now one of their special rooms has ramps that go all the way up and actually traverse along almost the ceiling and then come back down through various steps. So they're giving the cats, which is an animal that likes three-dimensional use of space, they're giving the cats that opportunity. They give them the opportunity to have soft surfaces. They provide multiple areas for critical resources, such as these soft beds, such as watering areas, such as food bowls, and multiple litter boxes, of course. And our formula with them is 2 boxes per cat, and then we limit the number of cats per room. Otherwise, the 2 boxes per cat doesn't work. And the cats, they were initially quite nervous about giving the cats protected outdoor space, worrying about birds flying in, bugs crawling in, and what that would do to their data. And one brave scientist said, it might not affect my data, but let's just see what the incidence is. And so that individual's cats were put in a pilot of what ultimately became an entire outdoor wing. This is obviously fenced in, and it again provides them with three-dimensional space so that they can continue to be socially housed and have indoor-outdoor access. Again, cats in groups, perhaps like the rabbits we were hearing about earlier, need a little space sometimes to get away from each other. So I think you can get a good sense of color. Again, not that cats have color vision like we do. Hiding places, again, soft surfaces, and opportunities for view lines into other spaces, and indoor-outdoor, all to accommodate social housing. So this institution has gone to fairly significant lengths to accomplish this for both their dogs and their cats. So I talked earlier that there were perhaps some additional topics that come up when all of us are looking at social housing. And the biggest one seems to center on cage space and what is appropriate cage space. So it's not that this is new, again, taking that historical perspective. Back in 1996, when we wrote in the guide that for some primates, you wouldn't necessarily have to double the cage space if they were compatible. And what we had in mind were the monkeys, the young monkeys you've all seen, that hug each other and stay in close proximity to each other in a very positive way. But if you did additive cage space, it was going to be in the better interest of the institution to just separate them and house them individually to get the density that they wanted. So we added that language in the 96 guide, that there might be behavioral reasons where you didn't have to make cage space additive, that the behavior of the animal could be more important than an inch or two, which may have absolutely no meaning to a particular animal. Well, that set up a fervor, needless to say. At the time, some of the federal agency representatives were a little unhappy that we had done that. But we said, we're not writing this for anybody but the community and the animals, and this is what we feel. So it stayed in, but it does beg the question of cage space. So the debate started at least back then, if not even earlier. And of course now, as was referenced earlier today, cage space for a number of species of animals is becoming a big question. If we're going to socially house rabbits, do we need to give them very large enclosures? If we're going to group house mice without aggression, how do we evaluate that? And how do we determine what the best space is? So looking at mice, because that seems to be where a lot of the energy is focused on the question, Hannah Werbel and I published a review not that long ago on mouse enrichment, and we took on the subject of cage space and did what, at the time, it's about a year and a half old now, was a very thorough literature review on how people evaluated cage space for mice, and why one article would say maximum of 3 mice in a cage, and why another would say, gee, 5 is fine, and we see no problems. And we dissected that out, and I would just refer you to the book chapter because it's way too complicated an issue to talk about in the remaining time. But it became, as we social house, this stimulated this entire question about addressing cage space and how do we keep our colony densities approximate to what they are now if we have to wind up offering more cage space. How do we social house in the right space so that we're not inducing aggression or we're not inducing some guarding of a resource? And so what we found in our literature review was, no surprise, varying recommendations regarding suitable densities. And in some cases, it was because different strains were trying to be compared, which I just don't think you can do. I really believe the mouse question is a lot more complicated than the primate question. And in some studies, they would take the standard cage box and increase animal density. And in other studies, they take the average animal density of, say, 5 and shrink the cage space. So you have really quite different approaches to evaluating population density. And needless to say, and no surprise, different results are generated depending upon how you address this question. And so I'm delighted to see that this is still being investigated because I don't think we're going to, well, I don't believe we're ever going to come up with a cookie cutter approach. So there is some good, solid studies out there that suggest that some transgenic strains really need a fewer number of animals in a cage. Others, because of their fragility, probably need a little bit more for the temperature in the cage and whatever, the support, I'm not sure. But clearly, we're going to have to take this almost, I think, on a case-by-case basis. And then, do all the measured parameters reflect the state of an animal's welfare? And I don't know the answer to that. And I put that out there as perhaps something that we've wrestled with historically, we've not answered, and I'm hoping as we continue down this path in the future, we'll continue to assess. So if your toenails don't grow as fast, which one report did say in a primate, does that mean negative welfare? Maybe. Maybe it's connected to something else. but I just don't know. So when you have parameters like that in the published literature, I'm not necessarily sure whether we should weight that the same as perhaps changes in our immunology or changes in our blood profiles or our heart rates or our cortisol levels. So it's just, we have to, I think, evaluate in a very objective, very parsimonious manner the parameters that are being evaluated in each of these studies and try and extrapolate whether that really matters to the animal. I mean, a mani-pedi a little more often may not hurt the monkey. So we just don't know whether some parameters really reflect the state of welfare. So you saw some really great pictures earlier today on some of the concerns with social housing of some mice. And the barbering and the fighting are clearly issues that are being addressed, being investigated. There's more knowledge being generated, more information that's going to guide our further and future actions. I don't think we're there yet, but it's very encouraging to me to see how this body of literature is increasing. And this was referenced yesterday by our OLAW colleagues, this webinar that was presented by OLAW that brought in discussions from Joe Garner and Guy Mulder and Axel Wolf, who's here in the audience. And it was really well done. So if you haven't listened to it, please go back, and there's some wonderful information in it. We had an excellent talk today about social housing of rabbits. The point was made quite well. Rabbits are social animals. And so if you just read the guide strictly, then you would think the expectation is to socially house those animals in the laboratory. What has happened with the new guide is, I believe, is that there are these renewed attempts to pair or group house our rabbits. And the problem, of course, as has been described very nicely, is long-standing reports back into the 60s of aggression between rabbits housed in laboratory conditions. But there are also reports of successful social housing of rabbits, and those are the bright lights, if you will. And like the mouse literature, I think we have to drill down and determine what are the similarities and differences in these studies where the folks at Drexel, I guess you said it was, are successful with 5 rabbits in an enormous amount of space, which most of us probably can't commit to 5 rabbits, and Canada and Europe, where they are able to socially house at least some rabbits, and the same story for mice. So we did have some discussions earlier about when the rabbits mature. I just think this thing about when good bunnies go bad is pretty amusing. The challenges of bunny teenagers. And this actually came from more of a pet industry website. So this is not an issue that is singular to laboratory animal research. It's one that others are wrestling with. So Vera Bauman's and Van Loo, they published just last year, and this is available on the web at this URL, and they had this wonderful graphic in the article that I thought fit in very nicely with a talk about a historical perspective. So on the top, again, these are European slides, but they illustrate the same point. On the top is old style, circa 1960, rat caging. On the middle picture is rat caging circa 1990, and then the more modern cage circa 2010. So again, showing this evolution, clearly more cage height has occurred when you look at that, more enrichment, although the social housing has been the same across the decades for rats at least, but as we've heard, they're a little bit easier to socially house. So as I come to the end of my presentation, I want to save a little time for questions if there are any. I love this phrase, the past is prologue. The past can tell us about the future. And so what we have here is the design of enclosures and how we're So we used to house monkeys as they come in from India in large groups, and we had problems. And now we're talking again about housing monkeys in groups, but in a more informed, more knowledgeable way, in facilities that are designed better to accommodate that kind of group housing. So we haven't come full circle, but we're building on information that we learned from the past so that we can help design equipment and facilities that will allow us to house our animals in an appropriate manner. So including visual breaks and hiding areas, accommodating the vertical tendencies of many species, whether that's rats that rear up or cats that like to jump up onto shelves, primates that flee rather, their first response is to jump up and back to a threat. And ease of removal from the cage when there are multiple animals. I mean, we've got a lot of positive reinforcement training programs for a variety of species, from clicker training of cats to primates. Rats, I believe, have been clicker trained. So a lot of ways in which training is being implemented to allow us to continue to access individual animals despite their social housing. And then design of facilities, as you've seen, I try to show, particularly for the dogs and cats, 2 examples that I've been particularly involved in myself. They're evolving as well. So even though they may look the same in terms of physical structure, that we have pens or runs, rooms, but they are really designed quite differently to accommodate the behaviors of the species that are being housed therein. And so here's a facility that I'm working with that is changing over and adding outdoor runs with better sight lines and allowing the animals to have a type of outdoor run that's not promoting jumping up on fences and other behaviors that start a whole series of aroused and excitation among other dogs in the facility. Carrying on with the past is Prologue. I think we're seeing, and I would continue to encourage you to offer training of your staff, certainly socializing behavior, socialization behavior, what are the signals the animals are giving off, no matter the species, but certainly even broader than that, what is the behavioral biology of the animal, its natural behaviors, because they don't all disappear in the laboratory, and it's a good starting place for staff to understand them. I think this is really important. I work with a program that had me come in and train their staff who are working with primates, and the animals were getting ready to be moved into a social housing situation, and the technician was 6 foot something. He towered over me, and he was like I do. He's gesticulating, but when I walk in a primate room, I make a point of holding my hands. He was gesticulating wildly, and the monkeys kept jumping back into the back of the cage every time he moved his arm. And he was tall enough that the second-tier animals were really quite responsive to his gesticulation, and he had no idea he was evoking that kind of response. And then we'd have the mutual threat by the animals at him, and it was just a matter of training him to understand that his behavior impacted each animal's behavior, and if they were socially housed, then the pair mate was also responding as well, what we heard about yesterday. So that training is really important. And I think globalization is going to continue to influence laboratory animal housing and management practices. Europe has a profound effect on multinational companies that are located here in the United States that might have their home base in Europe. Certainly with cage space, the strong support for environmental enrichment and social housing that is present in Europe and has certainly been emphasized under the revised directive. So there are countries that impact other countries, and I would say that the US and Europe and Canada, we impact many countries in Asia as we bring them along in terms of our thinking about animal welfare and how best to house animals. So there is this potential for global influence, and that is the benefit of a document like the guide, which last time around was translated into 12 different languages. So it's quite possible that it could have similar amount of translations this time and have still a very international influence, particularly with AAALAC using it as it does site visits. So globalization is not something we can ignore. Everything that we do certainly has an impact on other institutions around the world. And I just want to conclude with this quote from Winston Churchill, which I think is a good way to sum up my philosophy for this presentation. Every day you make progress. Every step may be fruitful. Yet there will stretch out before you an ever-lengthening, ever-ascending, ever-improving path. You know you will never get to the end of the journey. But this, so far from discouraging, only adds to the joy and glory of the climb. Thank you very much. Questions? I'm still green here, so. I figured on history there's probably not going to be too many questions. Many of you lived it with me. All right, thank you again.